50 of the most powerful people in Seoul watched the most feared man in the country drop to one knee in his own boardroom in front of a woman who arrived by bus. No bodyguard, no lawyer, just a woman in a plain gray coat carrying a cloth bag with a broken strap. The room didn't make a sound, not because they were being polite, because none of them could process what they were seeing. Kang Min-jun did not kneel, not for presidents, not for prosecutors, not for anyone. And yet there he was, one knee on the floor, head slightly bowed, in front of someone his own men had laughed at 30 minutes earlier. The woman's name was Nari Seo. She was 33 years old, and she ran a community kitchen in the Mangwon neighborhood, a part of Seoul that developers like Min-jun had been quietly circling for 2 years. She had come to this meeting to argue against the demolition of her neighborhood. She had a folder of signatures, a hand-drawn map of families affected, and absolutely no idea that the man sitting at the head of that table already knew her name, had known it for 17 years. What she noticed first was his wrist. She didn't know why her eyes went there. Maybe it was the way his sleeve shifted when he stood. But she saw it, a thin, faded cord bracelet, frayed at the edges, the kind a child would wear, the kind nobody keeps into adulthood unless it means something they can't say out loud. Her stomach did something strange. She told herself it meant nothing. She was wrong. Here's what none of those 50 people in that room knew. 17 years ago, in that same neighborhood they were planning to tear down, a hungry, bruised 13-year-old boy collapsed near a street food stall on a Tuesday morning in October. He had not eaten in 3 days. He was wearing shoes that didn't fit. He had a healing cut above his left eyebrow and the look of someone who had already decided that people could not be trusted. And the only person who stopped, out of everyone who walked past him that morning, was a 16-year-old girl who gave him the last 4 rolls of gimbap she had left. Not because she had extra. She didn't. She gave them because she couldn't walk away. That girl was Nari. She never saw that boy again. She assumed he moved on. She never thought about what happened to him after that morning. She had her own problems, rent, her mother's medication, the stall she was trying to keep alive. She was kind, not sentimental. She moved forward, the way people who don't have the luxury of looking backward always do. But the boy never forgot. And the boy, the starving, broken, invisible boy, grew into the man now kneeling on the floor in front of her. The question is not whether he remembered her. He remembered everything. The question is what he did with that memory for 17 years. And the answer to that question will make you rethink every assumption you've made about this story so far. Before we continue the story, subscribe to the channel and tell me which city you are watching from. I'd be happy to know you. And oh, pay attention because a twist you are not expecting is coming up later in the story. He was pretending to be invisible. That was the first thing Nari noticed. Not that he was hungry, not that he was hurt, but that he was actively trying to take up no space. He was pressed against the wall at the edge of the market with his knees pulled up and his chin down, wearing the specific stillness of someone who has learned that being noticed usually leads to something bad. She had seen that stillness before, in stray animals and in children who had stopped expecting adults to help them. She was 16 years old, and she was in the middle of her busiest hour, and she had exactly 4 gimbap rolls left, and rent was due in 5 days. She looked at him. She looked away. She took 2 steps toward her next customer. Then she stopped. She turned back. She didn't know why. Or rather, she knew exactly why, but couldn't have put it into a sentence that didn't sound embarrassing. She just could not make her feet keep walking. She picked up the last 4 rolls, wrapped them in paper, walked over, and crouched down in front of him. He flinched. An actual flinch, the kind that comes from being grabbed unexpectedly too many times. She stayed still, held the rolls out, and said nothing. No, poor thing. No, where are your parents? Just the food, held out flat in her palm, like she was feeding something she didn't want to startle. He looked at her hands for a long moment. Then he took the rolls. He ate all 4 in under a minute. She watched him and felt something she would not have had the words for at 16, but understood better at 33. That some hungers go so deep they stop feeling like hunger and start feeling like just the way things are. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, or not only from the cold. She noticed a healing cut above his left eyebrow. She noticed his shoes were 2 sizes too big, stuffed at the toe with what looked like newspaper. She noticed the thin cord bracelet on his wrist, red and gray, cheap and childish, the kind sold at school fairs. It was the only thing on him that looked like it might have once been a choice. She slipped her own bracelet off her wrist, identical because she had bought two the previous spring for reasons she no longer remembered. And without asking, without explaining, she reached out and tied it around his other wrist. His hand was so cold. That detail stayed with her for years without her understanding why. He looked up at her then. Really looked. The kind of eye contact that children who have been through things make very rarely because it costs them something. He didn't say thank you. He said, in a voice that was smaller than his face, "Why did you come back?" And she said, without thinking, because power without memory is just destruction wearing a suit. She didn't know where that came from. It just came out. He stared at her. She stood up, smoothed her apron, and said practically, "Stay warm." Then she went back to her stall. She did not watch him leave. She had 4 customers waiting and 0 rolls left, and a mental calculation running about whether she could afford more ingredients before tomorrow morning. That was her life, always the next practical thing. She was not a girl who dwelled. She was a girl who moved. So she moved. She did not see the black van 2 alleys over. She did not see the man who had been watching the boy for the last 40 minutes finally start walking toward him. She did not see what happened next. She would not know what happened next for 17 years. And by the time she found out, in a 31st floor boardroom, looking at a faded bracelet on the wrist of the most feared man in Seoul, the weight of that ordinary Tuesday morning would hit her with the force of everything she had never known she set in motion. She went back to her stall. He disappeared around the corner. And in that gap, between her turning away and him vanishing, the rest of this story was born. What happened to him in the hours after she walked away is something that will make you rethink every assumption you have about how much one moment can cost a person. The moment Minjun stopped being a boy and became something harder happened on a Wednesday night in Incheon, in a basement that smelled like motor oil and old concrete, when he was 15 years old. Taeho had sent him to deliver a package to a man named Cha, a port official who received packages on behalf of people he pretended not to know. Standard run. Minjun had done it 6 times before. But this time, when he arrived, Cha was not alone. There were 2 men in the room who were not supposed to be there. And the way they looked at the package and then at Minjun told him, in a wordless language that survival teaches faster than any school, that he was not going to be allowed to leave the usual way. He was 15. He had no weapon. He had no phone. What he had was the previous 2 years of watching every single person in Taeho's network, how they thought, what they feared, whose name made them hesitate. He took a breath. Then he said a name, just one name, quietly, almost casually, the name of the man directly above Taeho, a man these two had clearly not told about tonight's plan. He watched their faces. They let him go. He walked 12 blocks before his legs started shaking. He sat on a curb in the cold and waited for the shaking to stop. It took a while. When it did, he made himself replay every second of what had just happened, not to process it emotionally, but to extract every lesson it contained. He had one with information, with the credible suggestion that someone powerful was watching. He had one by making 2 men calculate risk in the 4 seconds before they acted. He filed that away with the same precision he filed everything. Then he stood up, went back to the basement where the other boys slept, lay down on his mat, and stared at the ceiling. On the wall beside him, barely visible in the dark, he had scratched 7 small marks into the concrete, 1 for each month he had been there. He added an 8th. Then he thought about a hand-painted sign with a small fish in the corner. He thought about 4 rice rolls. He thought about a bracelet on his wrist that had been on someone else's wrist first. And he made himself a promise. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet internal line that he drew in the dirt of who he was. I will not be here when I'm 16. He kept that promise with 11 days to spare. Not by escaping, by becoming indispensable to 3 different people above Taeho simultaneously, running small calculations for each of them, making himself the thread each one needed, until the morning Taeho called him in and said, with the flat irritation of a man who knows he's been outmaneuvered, "Someone's been asking for you." Minjun said nothing. He didn't need to. The someone in question was a man named Director Yu, a figure so far above Taeho's level that Taeho addressed him using formal language he used for no one else. Minjun had spent 4 months making sure you knew his name. He walked out of that basement into a car that you sent. He had not looked back. Looking back was a luxury, and he had not yet earned luxuries. He was not a better man than Taeho. He was a more sophisticated one, which in certain worlds is more dangerous. But he taught Minjun things Taeho never could. How money moved through legitimate structures, how legal language could be used like a wall around a legal space, how the most powerful people in any room were usually the quietest ones. Minjun absorbed everything with the focused hunger of someone who has decided that knowledge is the only inheritance available to him. He was not grateful to you. He was strategic about him. There is a difference, and Minjun understood it clearly. By 17, Minjun was doing work that men twice his age didn't understand well enough to supervise. By 18, 3 different people in Yu's network thought Minjun reported exclusively to them. He didn't. He reported to himself. He had built, inside the structure of someone else's operation, a quiet, invisible loyalty network of his own. Not for power. Not yet. For one specific purpose. He needed resources, and he needed freedom, and he needed to find a market stall in Mangwon with a hand-painted sign. Everything else was just the path to that. At 19, he left Yu's network the same way he left Taeho's. Not by fighting, not by running, but by making himself so structurally embedded in relationships above you that leaving became simpler than staying. He walked out on a gray Thursday morning with a phone, a bank account, and the kind of face that had learned to show nothing it wasn't ready to show. He was not free. He understood that freedom was going to take longer. But he was out, and being out was the first step toward the only thing that had kept the lights on inside him for 6 years, finding the girl who turned back. He got out by becoming the most useful person in every room he entered. But useful to who? And at what cost? Is the question that follows him into everything that comes next. If you're following the story, here's a good time to hit subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. As simple as it seems, this simple act means a lot to us. The first time Minjun had enough money to find her, he didn't go. That is the part of this story that will make you uncomfortable, because it wasn't fear that stopped him. It was shame. He was 21 years old, sitting in a rented room in Mapo with a phone and an investigator's report that had taken 3 weeks and more money than he had ever spent on anything personal. The report had a name, Nari's CO, an address, and a photograph taken from a distance. She was at her stall, laughing at something a customer said, her apron crooked, her hair pulled back unevenly. He sat with that photograph for 2 hours. Then he put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, closest to his chest, and made himself answer the question honestly. What exactly are you going to say to her? He had no answer. A boy she fed for 4 minutes had become someone who moved money through networks that didn't hold press conferences. He was not yet the man he needed to be before he could stand in front of her. So he waited. That decision cost him 3 years of sleep. Those 3 years were the most important of his life. Not because of what he built, but because of the specific moment he understood what he was actually building it for. He was 22. Sitting across from a property developer named Beck who wanted to use Minjun's logistics network to move capital through 3 shell companies. Standard arrangement. Profitable. Clean on paper. Minjun had reviewed the documents, done the math, and was already forming his agreement when he noticed one detail buried in the property acquisition list. A neighborhood in Mangwon. Specific streets. He recognized the cross-section immediately. He had memorized the map around Nari's stall the way soldiers memorize terrain. He looked at the acquisition purpose. Rezoning for industrial storage. He looked at the projected displacement. Approximately 340 residents. He set the document down. He told Beck no. Beck laughed. Minjun did not laugh back. He said, quietly, that the answer was no, and that if Beck pursued that particular acquisition through any network connected to Minjun, there would be consequences that Beck's lawyers would find very difficult to categorize. Beck left angry. Minjun lost 400 million won in projected revenue that quarter. He did not lose sleep over it. What he did instead, what he had been quietly engineering for 2 years already, was position his own company to acquire that section of Mangwon first. Not quickly, carefully, layer by layer, company by company, until the ownership chain was so clean and so deep that no rival could trace it back to him faster than he could move. It took 14 months. His financial team thought it was a speculative real estate play. His legal team processed the paperwork without knowing the full picture. Only one person on earth knew the real reason. And that person was Min-jun himself, alone in that Mapo room, telling nobody, carrying it the way he carried everything, silently, completely, and for longer than was probably healthy. The photograph stayed in his jacket pocket through 3 more years in 2 different jackets. He transferred it each time, carefully, without ceremony, because he had decided it was not a sentimental object. It was a standard, a reminder of the specific quality of person he was trying to be worth standing in front of. Some people carry photographs of people they love. Min-jun carried his like a performance review. Every decision he made, he held against it. Every shortcut he was tempted to take. He thought about the woman in the crooked apron who had given a stranger her last 4 rice rolls and made it look easy. By 24, his company was real. Not just legally, structurally, operationally real. He had built something that could survive without him, which meant he had built something genuine rather than something that was just an extension of his own will. That distinction mattered to him in a way he could not fully explain. He had seen what happened to men who built empires that were really just large versions of their own ego. They were fragile, those empires. One bad decision, and the whole thing was just a man standing in a room with nothing. He did not want that. He wanted something that could protect something else. Specifically, one kitchen, one street, one neighborhood that smelled like garlic and sesame, and something warm that doesn't have a name. He was 30 years old when his team finally brought him the Mangwon development file with a full map attached. He opened it, expecting confirmation of what he already knew. Instead, he found something his own logistics team had flagged as a complication. A community kitchen at the center of the acquisition zone run by a woman named Nari Seo, who had filed 3 separate objections to the rezoning application and organized 212 residents to sign a petition. He stared at her name on the document for a long time. Then, for the first time in 17 years, he did something he almost never did. He smiled, because she was still doing exactly what she had always done. Still turning back. Still refusing to walk away from something that needed her. He was not surprised. He was just, finally, after everything, ready. He spent 9 years building something specifically to protect her neighborhood before she knew his name. But Nari was about to walk into his boardroom and fight him. And what she said in that room would shake him harder than any rival ever had. Nari almost didn't go. The night before the meeting, her neighbor, a 67-year-old woman named Jiamja, who had lived in Mangwon for 40 years and made the best doenjang jjigae on the street, sat in Nari's kitchen and cried quietly into a cup of barley tea. Not dramatically, just the tired kind of crying that older women do when they've run out of fight but haven't run out of love for something. Jiamja's apartment was in the demolition zone. She had nowhere to go, and watching her, Nari made a decision. She packed her folder of signatures, drew a fresh copy of her neighborhood map, and told herself that the worst they could do was say no. She had heard no before. It had never stopped her. The boardroom was on the 31st floor of a building in Uedo that smelled like cold air and expensive wood. Nari counted at least 12 men in suits before she stopped counting. She was the only person in the room without a business card. Someone near the door looked at her cloth bag and then looked away, the way people do when they've already decided you don't belong somewhere. She sat down, opened her folder, and waited. She had learned, from years of dealing with landlords and city officials and market committees, that the person who speaks first in a room they don't own is usually the person who loses. Min-jun walked in 7 minutes late. That detail matters, because he was never late. His assistant said later that he had stood outside the boardroom door for 4 of those 7 minutes. Just stood there, breathing. Nari didn't know that. She just saw a man in a dark suit sit down at the head of the table and look at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not cold, not warm, something in between that made her slightly uncomfortable in a way she couldn't name. She presented her case cleanly. No vaguing, No teatrix. She showed the map, named the families, explained what the community kitchen provided. 340 meals a week to elderly residents. A homework space for 43 children, the only free health screening point in a 6-block radius. She laid it out the way you lay out facts when you respect the people listening enough to not manipulate them. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then she said one more thing, something she hadn't planned to say. She said, "Whoever built this project has a lot of power, but power without memory is just destruction wearing a suit." The man at the head of the table went completely still, and Nari, watching him, felt that strange stomach feeling again, the same one she'd felt when she noticed his bracelet. One of his lieutenants leaned over to whisper something. Minjun didn't respond. He was looking at Nari the way you look at something you thought you'd lost. She didn't know that. She thought she had made him angry. She hadn't made him angry. She had just said, almost word for word, the same thing she had muttered to herself on that October morning 17 years ago. Right before she turned around, walked back to a collapsed boy near her stall, and gave him everything she had left. He had heard it then. He had never forgotten it. And now the question burning through this entire room, the one nobody had words for yet, was whether she was about to find out why. Minjun dismissed the entire room in under 30 seconds. Not rudely, just efficiently, the way a man does when he's made a decision and doesn't need an audience for what comes next. 12 suits gathered their folders and walked out without a single question. That alone told Nari something important about the kind of man she was dealing with. When the last person closed the door, it was just the two of them, her folder of signatures on one side of the table, his silence on the other. She prepared herself for rejection. A polite one, probably. The expensive kind that uses words like, "we'll review your concerns," and means absolutely nothing. Instead, he said, "Where did you hear that phrase?" Nari blinked. Which phrase? Power without memory is just destruction wearing a suit. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the question was so unexpected. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've been saying it for years. I think I made it up." He nodded slowly, like she had just confirmed something he already knew. That nod unsettled her more than anything else in the room. She asked him directly because Nari was always direct. "Do you know what it means to the people on that map? Or is this neighborhood just a number in a spreadsheet to you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something that cracked the entire surface of the meeting. He rolled up his left sleeve, slowly, deliberately, and there it was, that faded cord bracelet she had noticed when he walked in. Up close, she could see it clearly now. It was old, handmade, a simple weave of red and gray cord, the kind children sold at school fairs for 201. He watched her face as she looked at it, and she felt it, that stomach feeling, turn into something colder and more specific. Where have I seen this before? Her mind reached backward. Not a last week, not a last year, 17 years back, a Tuesday in October, a boy on the ground near her stall. She had tied that bracelet around his wrist herself, taken it off her own wrist because his hand was shaking so badly from the cold and she hadn't known what else to do. Her folder slipped off the table. She didn't notice. She looked at his face, really looked the way you look when you're searching for someone inside someone else, and there it was. Not the 13-year-old face, but something behind the eyes that hadn't changed. Something that recognized her back. Her voice, when it came out, was barely above a whisper. That bracelet. He didn't say yes. He didn't need to. He just held her gaze with the kind of steadiness that only comes from 17 years of waiting for one specific moment. The most feared man in Seoul, the man whose name made prosecutors nervous and rivals relocate, sat across from her with the eyes of the boy she had refused to walk past. And here's the part that will hit you hardest. Nari didn't cry first. She got angry. Real, shaking anger, because in the folder that slipped off that table was Jiamja's name, was 43 children's homework space, was 340 meals a week, and the boy she had saved had come back as the man trying to erase everything she had spent her life building. She stood up. "You knew," she said. "This whole time, you knew it was my neighborhood. And you still," she stopped, because the look on his face stopped her. It was not the look of someone caught. It was the look of someone who had been waiting to explain something painful for a very long time. Nari did not sit back down. That is the detail that mattered most in that moment, because everything Minjun said next, he said to a woman who was still standing, still choosing, second by second, whether to stay in the room. She had her folder pressed against her chest like a shield, and her jaw set in the way that people who have spent years being underestimated learn to hold themselves when they refuse to shrink. He didn't ask her to sit. He understood, without being told, that asking her to sit right now would be exactly the wrong thing. So he just started talking, and she stood there and listened, not because she trusted him, but because 17 years of not knowing deserve at least the next 5 minutes of truth. He told her about the van, about Incheon, about Taeho. He didn't dramatize it. He told it the way people tell things that happened to them. So long ago the pain has calcified into just fact. She listened and felt something uncomfortable moving through her. Not pity, because he wasn't asking for that, but the particular discomfort of realizing that a moment you barely remember was for someone else the dividing line between before and after. She had turned back for 4 minutes on a Tuesday morning. He had lived inside those 4 minutes for 17 years. That asymmetry sat in the room like a third person. She asked him the question she needed answered most. Not, why didn't you find me sooner? She understood that. Actually, more than he might expect. She asked, did keeping this secret make you feel safe? Or did it make you feel like you still had something left that nobody could take? He went quiet. Not the strategic quiet she had seen from him in the meeting. A different kind. The kind that means someone has just described something true about them that they have never heard out loud before. He said, after a long moment, both. Probably both. She nodded. That was an honest answer. She had more respect for an honest, complicated answer than a clean one. Inside her chest, something was working through a very difficult calculation. She was not a romantic. She was not going to stand in a 31st floor boardroom and let one revelation erase what was still real, that her neighbors' lives have been held in uncertainty for 2 years because of decisions made in rooms exactly like this one. Gratitude for his past did not pay Jiamja's rent. Memory did not automatically equal right action. She knew this. She held it firmly. And yet, the bracelet was real. The flinch she suddenly remembered, a 13-year-old boy pulling back from an outstretched hand, was real. Both things existed at the same time, and she was adult enough to hold them both without choosing the easier one. She finally sat down, not because she'd resolved anything, but because standing was starting to feel like performance. She put the folder on the table between them, not as a barrier, but as a reminder. These are real people, she said. Whatever happened to you, and I'm not dismissing it, these are real people who need to know they are safe. He looked at the folder. Then he looked at her. I know, he said. That's why I need you to help me do this right. Not for me, for them. She studied his face for a long moment, checking for the thing people do when they want something, that particular shine of performance. It wasn't there. It was the most dangerous moment in the entire afternoon. Not because of anything threatening, but because Nari realized quietly and with zero drama that she believed him. And believing someone who operates in the world the way Minjun does is not a small decision. It is the kind of decision you make with your eyes open, knowing the risk, accepting the weight, or you don't make it at all. She had just opened her mouth to say something back when the window on the east wall made a sound like the world tearing in half. And every decision in that room got suspended in the space of one sharp, flat second. She had just decided to trust him. And the universe, or someone in it, had very different plans for that moment. What came through that window next didn't just interrupt their conversation. It changed the stakes of everything they had just agreed to. The gunshot didn't sound like movies make you think it sounds. It was sharp and flat at the same time, like something being torn. The window on the east side of the conference room fractured, but didn't shatter, and for exactly 2 seconds, nobody in the building understood what had happened. Then Minjun was on his feet, and his hand was on Nari's arm, and she was moving before her brain had finished processing the sound. He pulled her below the table level with a grip that was firm but not rough. The grip of someone who has rehearsed for danger so many times it became instinct. His eyes were scanning the room. Calm, cold, completely focused. This was a different man from the one who had been sitting across from her 30 seconds ago, with something close to vulnerability on his face. Two of his men appeared from nowhere, or what felt like nowhere, and within 90 seconds a room had been cleared, the floor secured, and Nari was in an interior corridor with no windows, her back against a concrete wall, her heart going at twice its normal speed. She realized her hand was shaking. She also realized Minjun had not let go of her arm. She looked at where his hand met her sleeve, and he followed her eyes and released her. "Are you hurt?" His voice was completely steady. She shook her head. He nodded once and turned back to his men. She watched him work. Quiet instructions, precise questions, no panic, and understood for the first time, in her body rather than just her mind, exactly what kind of world this man lived in every single day. Here is what his team found out within the hour. The shot had not been random. It was a warning sent by a rival network that had been watching the Mangwon development deal and had figured out, before Nari had, that Minjun was restructuring the project in a way that cut them out of a significant profit share. They didn't know who Nari was. They didn't care. She had simply been in the room. But Minjun knew something his team didn't yet. That being in that room, connected to him even for one afternoon, had just put a target on the back of a woman who fed elderly neighbors and tutored other people's children. That realization did something to him that no rival, no threat, no loss of money had ever done. It frightened him, not for himself, for her. And fear, for a man like Minjun, does not produce helplessness. It produces decisions. Fast, irreversible, total decisions. He came back to where she was sitting in the corridor. She had stopped shaking. She was actually reading through her folder again. Jiamja's petition form, slightly crumpled now. He stared at her for a moment. "You're reviewing documents." She looked up. "Someone has to." He sat down on the floor beside her. Not on a chair, not across from her, just down on the floor, back against the same wall, the way two people sit when the formality is finally gone. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why the project was built here. The real reason, not the version my company filed." She closed the folder, because the look on his face told her this was the piece of the story she had been missing. And whatever it was going to hurt before it helped. He built the project in Mangwon on purpose. Not to destroy it. But why? The answer coming next is the one twist that reframes this entire story from the very beginning. "I didn't buy Mangwon to tear it down." He said it quietly, the way people say true things they've carried alone for too long. "I bought it so that someone else couldn't." Nari didn't speak. She had learned, in years of negotiating with people who had more power than her, that silence after a big statement is more useful than a question. So she waited. And Minjun, for the first time and longer than he could remember, told the truth to another person without calculating what it would cost him. Here is what he told her. The same network that had taken him off the street at 13, the one Taeho answered to, the one that moved boys like packages between cities, had been trying to acquire a large section of Mangwon for 6 years. Not for apartments, not for retail, for logistics, underground logistics. The neighborhood sat above a corridor of old utility tunnels that connected 3 districts, and certain people had very specific uses for tunnels that didn't appear on city maps. Minjun knew this because he had spent years making it his business to know everything those people did. When he saw the acquisition plan moving forward 18 months ago, he made a decision. He got there first. He outbid them quietly, through enough shell layers that nobody connected his name to the purchase until the contracts were already signed. The development project, the one Nari had walked into his boardroom to fight, was never going to look like the proposal his public team filed. That version was a placeholder, a legal necessity. The actual plan, the one that existed only in his private files and his own head, was different. The community kitchen stays. The elderly residents stay in upgraded units at the same rent they currently pay, locked in contractually for 20 years. The children's study space gets 3 times the floor area it currently has. The neighborhood gets rebuilt around the people who already live there, not clear to make room for people who can pay more. He had been trying to find a way to tell her that. He just hadn't expected her to walk into his building first. Nari sat with that for a long moment. She was not a woman who accepted information uncritically just because it came with emotion attached. She asked him the hard question, the one that mattered most. And if I hadn't come, if no one had pushed back, would you have found a way to tell us? Or would we have found out when the construction started and just had to trust that a man none of us knew had decided to be kind? He didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was uncomfortable, and she saw that. She nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He didn't defend himself. That surprised her more than anything he'd said. He just said, "You're right. I should have come to you first." I told myself I was protecting the neighborhood, but I was also protecting myself from having to explain things I've never explained to anyone. She looked at him, this man who had built a fortress out of silence and strategy, and saw, briefly, the 13-year-old underneath. Not as an excuse, just as a fact. People become the shapes that survival carves into them. That doesn't make every decision right, but it makes them human. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A message from GM. There are men outside the kitchen. They say they're from a development company, but they won't show identification. Should I call someone? Nari looked up at Minjun. He was already reading the message over her shoulder. Not intrusively, but because he had gone still again in that particular way that meant his mind was already 3 steps ahead of the room. He stood up. "That's not my team," he said, and the look on his face told her that whoever it was, GM's instinct to be worried was exactly right. The rival network didn't just fire a warning shot. They sent people to the neighborhood while Minjun was occupied in this building. And what happens in the next 60 minutes will determine whether everything he built and everything she protected survives the night. By the time Minjun's car reached Mangwon, GM had already done something nobody expected. She had locked the kitchen door, turned off the lights, and called every neighbor she knew, which was everyone. And within 20 minutes, the street outside had 43 residents standing in it. Old men with folded arms, mothers with children on their backs, the fish seller, the hardware store owner. Not aggressive, just present, just immovable in the way that only people who have lived somewhere their whole lives can be immovable. The 3 men outside who had been sent to assess the building's entry points took one look at the crowd and made phone calls instead of decisions. That small delay was the only window Minjun needed. He handled it the way he handled everything, quietly, completely, and in a way that would never appear in a police report. 2 calls. For minutes. The men left. Nari watched from the car and didn't ask how. She was learning that there were parts of his world that worked precisely because they didn't require explanation. That was something she would have to think about later. Carefully, honestly, without the adrenaline of the last 3 hours clouding her judgment. But right now, GM was walking toward the car, and Nari stepped out to meet her, and the old woman grabbed her by both arms and said, "I made you porridge. Come inside before you catch cold." Some things don't change regardless of what else is happening. That is either the most ordinary or the most extraordinary thing about real life, depending on the day. Minjun stood on the street outside the kitchen. He didn't come in. Nari noticed. She went back to the door and looked at him, standing in the neighborhood he had secretly spent 2 years protecting, in a street that had no idea who he was. And she said simply, "Come eat." He looked at her for a moment. Then he came inside. GM put a bowl in front of him without ceremony, glanced at his face once, and said, "You look like someone who hasn't had a proper meal cooked for him in years." He said nothing, but he finished the entire bowl. The conversation that happened at that table over the next 2 hours was not dramatic. It was the harder kind, the real kind. Nari told him that gratitude doesn't cancel accountability, that even if his intentions for the neighborhood were good, the people who live there deserve to have been part of the decision from the beginning. He agreed, not performatively, with the specific, quiet agreement of someone taking a correction they know they earned. He told her he wanted to restructure the project with the community's direct input, a resident committee with real authority, not advisory power. She told him she would hold him to that in writing. He said he expected nothing less. There was a moment near the end when GM fell asleep in her chair at the end of the table, the way old people do, suddenly and without embarrassment, and the kitchen went quiet. Nari looked at the bracelet on Minjun's wrist. "You kept it 17 years. He looked at it too. It was the only thing I owned that nobody gave me for a reason. She understood that. She understood it in the deep way that doesn't need more words. She said, I almost didn't turn back that morning. I was already walking away. He said, I know. I watched you turn back. Something passed between them then. Not romantic, not resolved, just honest. The kind of honest that is the beginning of something, not the end. 3 days later, Minjun walked back into his own boardroom. The same room where this story started, with Nari beside him and a revised development proposal in front of his entire team. He did not explain the change to anyone before the meeting. He simply presented the new plan, resident-led, community-protected, GMJA's building untouched, the kitchen expanded, the tunnels beneath the neighborhood reported to the city authorities through a legal channel that had taken his lawyers 48 hours to construct carefully. His team was silent. Then he said one last thing, to the room, but really to the folder Nari was holding across the table. Everything I built was to keep a promise. It took me too long to understand that keeping a promise and keeping a secret are not the same thing. Then he looked at her, and she nodded. And that, right there, was the moment a room full of powerful people finally understood what they had actually been part of all along. What would you have done in her position? Forgiven him or walked away? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, you already know what to do. Because the next story we tell might be the one that changes how you see someone in your own life. Subscribe to the channel now. Don't miss it.